Yes, now I will tell you everything, but actually, I wanted to thank beforehand some people. So after this morning, I wanted to say that, okay, I invite you, I thank you for the invitation, Ilaria, Maria Grazia. It was not only an invitation, they forced me to come. Oftentimes, I'm closed in my study, I don't want distractions, I want to be enclosed in my world to create with no distractions. But being here with you this morning, with many friends and people, institutions from all over the world, has reinforced this idea of responsibility. So being part of a path which was not born today but many years ago and is not coming to an end today. But the special part is that today we live in a world that, be it for the pandemic, be it for the importance of the technology on our lives, I think it's mature to finally better understand on a larger scale certain dynamics. So what happened here and will happen here today with the museum is very interesting for me. I just came back to Italy after 20 years, so coming back and finding this makes me very happy.
Just in celebration of our English friends. I hope that's okay. Also perché in italiano sono un po' dislessico, quindi ormai sono più abituato in inglese. Quindi se posso avere tutte le luci off come...
So can I have all the lights off, please?
Allora, io ho cominciato in realtà facendo...
So I started out. Okay, I'm gonna switch to.
like doing art when I was in high school as a kid. And I remember I was so intrigued, so fascinated by this sort of computational, this kind of compositional analysis that they told us to do at the time. Very sort of rudimental diagrams that try to illustrate a different type of vision of a painting, perhaps a very analytical description of a painting. It's almost if you really go through this iconographic layer to look at things in a new way, to look at something that is so familiar, but with a sort of different pair of eyes. It was a kind of exercise. And I remember it was really the beginning of this interest I have into observing the world through this kind of different pair of eyes. And now if we fast forward 25 years, we live in a world where these observations have become incredibly complex, incredibly sophisticated. We live in a planet where machines are observing the world on our behalf and rendering back information to us, sometimes with logics that we struggle to understand even ourselves, sometimes even engineers that program such systems. So I'm really fascinated by this idea, like how do machines see the world? How would they understand something that perhaps is so familiar to our normal human eyes, but what if you could put a very different pair of eyes? You could analyze things with a very different time frame, with a very different speed. And then this kind of goes into my interest for traditional observations and heritage. Like, what if you take a machine to perhaps paint a landscape? What if you're sharing this kind of relationship of art making and creativity with a machine? So on one side, yes, we live in a very strange and dystopian present with things that are happening that are beyond our comprehension, and we do feel the pain of that. But on the other hand, there is also this kind of continuity of this techno-optimism that they were talking about before. And somehow I come a little bit from that era of excitement, and I still bring forward this strange idea of a new possible sublime of taking machines along with us to observe the world, but also almost going back to these traditions. And really my work, it is about re-exploring some heritage, some traditions, but with very new technological apparatuses. Technology for me, it's not really a tool. I don't really like seeing technology just as a tool to develop my ideas. Technology for me is a collaborator. The machines I use become collaborators. The system I develop becomes collaborators through which discover ideas, through which discover new visions, to which transcend perhaps human limitations and capabilities. And so really for me, the key is the interaction between these things and the fine interaction between machines and humans. So sometimes I use machines that are made for measuring things, kind of engineering tools made for specific engineering purposes. And I sort of tend to like to somehow misuse technology, misuse machines. And I started using laser scanners quite a while ago, I mean more than 10 years ago. And somehow originally I was curious about the potential, the incredible capabilities of these machines. But actually, when I started exploring these landscapes, which can be defined as incredibly complex geometries, these geometries are so complex that ultimately these machines are not really able to actually bring forward the tasks that they were supposed to do to render this data perfectly. And so I started to become and fall in love with the impossibility of these machines to replicate, and perhaps the expressiveness of the data that arise from these impossibilities. A bit like the Impressionists that they were painting, and at some point the idea wasn't so much to paint it as realistic as we were seeing, but to include several things into these paintings. And the process is one of these elements that is included into these paintings. And the same here, the fact of not so much modifying the data, simply observing the data, but capturing the data in specific conditions allows for this data to become incredibly expressive. So on one side, I started playing with this idea of these enormous resolutions, hundreds of millions of these points that were gathered, printed on this enormous scale. And you have these objects that can be explored almost and read almost as a book. You can get close as like that, as what you were seeing before, but also step away and started to see something that is more familiar to us somehow. So again, on this idea of the tradition of landscape painting, this is something always been obsessed about. And the process of how I make work, it is somehow for me almost as important as the final work itself. I really like to put myself in the shoes of this sort of 19th century painter that confronts himself with nature. Something interesting about Monet, that at some point he realized what type of nature would really reflect better in his way of painting. And so he started becoming a gardener. He started really engineering this kind of composition in the real world to be able to paint this. So in a sort of similar sense, I try to go back to some of these places, some of these locations, some of these traditions, with a sort of similar intent, similar approach, but again with a very different technological apparatus, with a very different pair of eyes. And so here, almost creating this kind of analysis, observations that are not just made by machines that perhaps create videos or images that resemble what we see, a type of data that transcend that, that goes beyond that. And I'm really fascinated by, again, observing these familiar compositions in ways that simply we don't. Really reflect on this opportunity, what if, and how could I paint a landscape if these machines are working along with me. So on one side, again, my obsession with tradition also goes a bit into aesthetics. I am, on one side, incredibly fascinated by new aesthetics, what really is driven by machines and the logic behind machines. But at the same time, I'm also very interested in sculptural and pictorial traditions. And so I started developing systems to simulate this kind of pictorial traditions. As you can see here, this series of gestures are completely computer generated. and the systems I developed, they work in real time, almost like a musical instrument. So I'm really able to interact and calibrate these systems as he paints. So there is also that kind of strange performative aspect of it. So what could happen if you can suddenly paint thousands of brushstrokes every second? What can happen if you could start exploring this pictorial materiality with a very different type of logic? I'm just gonna skip through like a few of these examples. Unfortunately, this is sort of low resolution PowerPoint presentation, so this stuff, they really render a very different type of physicality when they're seen at the correct sort of scale and resolution and so on. But somehow it gives you an idea also of how some of these computational processes become physical experiences. And for me, the materiality and the transformation of computational logic into physical experiences, it's really crucial. I mean, ultimately, I'm interested in making images and experiences for people, not so much for machines. And I think for me, although the work might seem very ephemeral, actually it is incredibly physical. My installations become these large objects of contemplation, sometimes also inspired by these immersive rooms of the Impressionists themselves. Actually, that one was in Milan, I think. I'm gonna talk like very briefly before I start changing routes, and I know already gonna start and go over time, but you're able to stop me, I guess, if you need it. But another topic that always intrigued me is this sort of shift between representation and abstraction, which usually in the sort of art history kind of process, it's always been seen as two separate things, two separate languages. But there was that moment in history, from Turner to the Impressionists and the avant-gardes, where really there was this kind of strange hybrid place. So this project is really based on sort of celebration of this kind of sublime explored by Turner. And I went back to some of these landscapes and in Cornwall to really film this. Let me see if I can, maybe I can talk underneath. So again, here it's another example of observing nature, observing this very special big storm that happened on the coast of Cornwall in the UK, where these images were then analyzed. And so not just the sort of composition of the image, it's analyzed through my systems, but also the behavior itself, the actual motion of the sea itself and the vectors that govern this kind of movements. So you could say that all of my work, it is somehow documentation of processes. I'm very interested in this idea of really rendering in a sort of quite pure state a specific process. And even the final piece, it's never quite finished for me. It's always the representation of a process that ultimately it's iterative and it's never ending. And if you think about the apotheosis of the object that tells the history of its creation, that really speaks about process, for me, there's nothing like these unfinished sculptures from Michelangelo, which have been really my obsessions for many years. And what intrigued me a little bit, like those observations of those diagrams I was doing in high school on these classical paintings, here is the same. it's not really the figure, the true subject of these sculptures, is the articulation of matter itself. It is the process embedded into the stone. The logic, the sort of idea of human craftsmanship somehow. All these marks of the chisels really document an action. It's an object that somehow moves over time. So I started exploring this topic now quite a few years ago, somehow on this sort of obsession of trying to sculpt, but in a very different way, with very different type of strategies. So this idea of removing matter, articulating matter, and documenting this process through computational methods. So really analyzing some of these archetype of classical and sort of Renaissance and Baroque sculptures, but not really with the objective of resculpting them, but rather to explore the infinite possibilities embedded in the matter that surrounds these sculptures. And so again, these systems and these simulations are there not to remake an original sculpture, but rather to discover new aesthetics and to render new processes and new sort of expressiveness into the manipulation of matter. And again, as everything I do, it's computational. I never really touched anything with my hands in my life, really. But somehow the access of certain type of technology now really allows these completely immaterial processes to render and become incredibly material. So here is a simulation of sort of material removal and how the sort of tip of this milling machine can remove material and sort of discover all of these different steps and these different states along with it. So the idea is to control these industrial machines, these industrial robots, usually built for production chains, usually built to actually carry out repetitive operations that in my case though are used to make this kind of unique sort of artistic gestures and translate essentially computational processes, computational logics, computational aesthetics onto physical matter. So this is also why it's like digital, it's a word that I never quite use in my work, because ultimately my work is incredibly physical, although it is digital at the same time. And I think this difference really, I mean, we live in a world where it's not really there anymore. I don't think there is even the purpose of discussing this difference. And in fact, even in my exhibitions, I like to blur these kind of lines. I started working with robots originally just to produce my sculptures, but more and more, they are becoming a performance. They are becoming a sort of act that enters the museum, enters the exhibition space, and becomes a sort of mysterious object that is there milling the sculptures during the exhibition itself. And even the objects and the sculptures really celebrate this idea of process. It's not so much about finishing an object, but in fact, I'm finishing it almost as a reverse engineering strategy. So I've worked with robots of different scales. At some point, for the joy of my wife, I also bought one. And these have been this kind of exploration, mostly focused on this idea of performing robots, bringing them into the exhibition space. Until recently, finally, I sort of closing or opening this sort of next chapter into this whole process, which is something I always had in mind, always dreamed of, but never quite figured out exactly how to do it, at least to do it without having to touch anything. And so finally I started a collaboration with the historical marble quarry in Carrara called Cave Adolfo Corsi, and figured out a way to control these special robots they have over there with my own experimental ways. And so I think here it's really an example of this apotheosis of the digital that becomes physical, and really the blurring between these two worlds. And yes, I think that's it. Probably I ran a bit over time, but that's my son also.
It's okay.
Another
Thank
physical
you.
thing.
Thank you.